So the intentions behind this event are self-interrogation, honest discourse, and a commitment to nuance. There are over 350 nonprofits in New Haven alone, and Yale being the largest among them. Welcome, belly of the beast. I personally, in my lifetime and my time here at Yale, have had the savior mentality reinforced and valued, and I'm personally trying to learn more about it and transform it within myself, and I encourage any students in the audience to do the same. We hope the conversations here today spark more dialogue and action, and obviously these conversations have been happening for a long time, and they will continue hopefully to happen with all of us. So with that as our little welcome and caveat, we have a few shout outs to give before we get into it with our amazing panel. First and foremost, thank you to, so this is our list of co-sponsors, Afro-American Cultural Center, the SAI Center for Innovative Thinking, the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, thank you, the Yale School of Public Health, the Yale Poynter Fellowship in Journalism, the Yale Global Health Justice Partnership, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the School of Medicine, the Yale University Dwight Hall, the Yale Graduate and Professional School Senate, the Net Impact Club at the School of Management, and the Equity and Inclusion and Diversity Committee at the School of Forestry. Special shout out to Aaron at Heartfelt Catering for providing the food. He has business cards, everyone should hire him. And
also, there's an after party. It's at Anchor Spa, which is on 272 College and Chapel. The first 40 people there get free drink tickets. So continue the conversation over libations and great music. After that, without further ado, let's introduce our coordinator for the night, or our moderator for the night. Yes, Angela Clinton. She is a racial equity organizer who directs the Organizer's Path and serves as capacity building and training partner at CEIO, which stands for Co-Creating Effective and Inclusive Organizing and Organizations. Thank you, Angela, for being with us tonight, and we are going to get out of your way.
Go ahead. Thank you. Is this on? No? Nope. It is. Okay.
Let's try one of them.
Okay.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey. Okay, so as a white person who is committed to ending racism and white supremacy in myself and in our country and in the world, it is an honor to be here moderating this panel, and it's an honor to be sitting in these hard questions with all of you. Tonight we are going to be exploring dynamics of power, privilege, racism, classism, financial incentive. These dynamics function both at the systemic and structural level and at the individual and personal level. Capitalism and white supremacy are guiding forces that shape our society's institutions and ideas. So tonight, rather than making blanket statements about all nonprofits and the people working for them as being fundamentally bad, we're trying to bring some nuance to this interrogation of how society can meet all of the needs of all of its citizens, its people. One focus of tonight's panel will be on individual behaviors and how they exacerbate or alleviate the harmful repercussions of capitalism and white supremacy. When designing this panel, the organizers, who you just met, and there are many more of them, intentionally chose people with varying roles in social movements and nonprofits, and with varying identities and levels of privilege to participate, so that we can unpack the unique roles of individuals in this shared struggle. To segue to our panel, a note on terminology. People in this room may have varying levels of familiarity of the concept of the nonprofit industrial complex. So before getting into the questions with the panelists, we wanted to offer a definition to work with for this evening. This definition comes from Insight, a group of women, gender nonconforming, and trans people of color against violence. And are we putting it up, or am I just reading it? Okay, so this is a lot. Just brace yourself. The nonprofit industrial complex is a system of relationships between the state or local and federal governments, the owning classes or the wealthy, foundations, and the nonprofit, NGO, social service, and social justice organizations. So it's a system of relationships between those four things, and that results in the surveillance, the control, derailment, and everyday management of political movements. The state uses nonprofits to monitor and control social justice movements, to divert public money into private hands through foundations, to manage and control dissent in order to make the world safe for capitalism, to redirect activist energies into career-based modes of organizing, instead of mass-based organizing capable of actually transforming society. It allows corporations to mask their exploitative and colonial work practices through, quote, philanthropic work, and encourages social movements to model themselves after capitalistic structures rather than to challenge those structures. So there is a lot in that definition, and we recognize this, and we hope that this discussion tonight will help to dig into at least some of that. We have prepared questions, the organizers have prepared questions for the panelists, and I will be asking those questions. But as I said to the panelists before, I think panels work best if you all engage in this as a conversation between you two also, and feel like you can ask each other questions. The audience, you have bios of everybody on the panel. So to get started, I'm just going to very briefly introduce each person and ask you to make a comment or two about why you were interested and or agreed to be on this panel. So our first panelist is Kerry Ellington. Kerry is a grassroots community organizer and radical educator, recently recognized by Connecticut Magazine as Connecticut's 40 Under 40, class of 2018. Kerry is one of the community organizers of People Against Police Brutality, which is a grassroots organization that fiercely organizes victims, families, and communities impacted by police violence and advocates for police accountability across the state. Welcome, Kerry. And just to kick us off, can you briefly tell us why you're here tonight?
Hello, everyone. I'm a little loud, unapologetically. I'm here tonight because the nonprofit industrial complex is a very real and alive and practiced system in New Haven, and it's something that needs to be dismantled just as much as any other oppressive system. And I just have different purviews from the work and the different spaces that I've been in, and I'm excited to participate in the discourse.
Thank you. Wow. Our next panelist is Jordan Flaherty, who's an award-winning journalist, producer, and author. He's the author of two books that are in the back. The first is Floodlines, Community and Resistance from Katrina to the Jena 6. And the new book, which was an inspiration for this panel tonight, No More Heroes, Grassroots Responses to the Savior Mentality. Jordan played himself on the HBO television series Treme, and he was the target of the New York City Police Department's spying programs. Welcome, Jordan. Please just share with us why you're here.
Hi, everybody. I am here because I believe that as a white male, it's my duty, job, mission to challenge white supremacy and patriarchy and call out that behavior in myself and in others coming from a position of privilege, not to tear them down, but to lift all of us up and build our movement stronger.
Thank you. I'm going in order, at alphabetical order, which is listed on your bios, just so you know. So the next person is Erin Livensparger. I'm so sorry. Erin is a staff trainer for Planned Parenthood of Southern New England, working with a diverse staff in different communities across both Connecticut and Rhode Island. She's a certified HIV counselor, tester, and has done work in many settings, including schools, residential programs, correctional facilities, and shelters. Welcome, Erin.
Is this one on? Hello. Hi. My name's Erin. I've been in nonprofit healthcare sector for about 16 years, Title X family planning programs, and healthcare has roots in racism and ableism and saviorism, and I've got to do transformative work for myself so that I don't perpetuate those things, and that there aren't barriers to the care and the treatment that folks deserve. So that's why I'm here tonight.
Thank you. Kika Matos is the Director of Immigrant Rights and Racial Justice at the Center for Community Change, an organization whose mission is to empower the people most affected by the injustices, to lead movements to improve the policies and affect their own lives. She has extensive experience as an advocate, community organizer, and lawyer. Welcome, Kika.
Thank you. And let me just say I'm a recovering lawyer. I'm a full-time organizer now. I am here because, at the risk of stating the obvious, I am a Black Latina woman who has dedicated her life to fighting for the liberation of our people. And in that fight, I encounter white saviorism almost every day. I'm here because we are living a time in our history where white supremacy has never been so prevalent, and there's a connection between white saviorism and white supremacy. And I think all of us have to commit ourselves to getting rid of both white supremacy and white saviorism.
Thank you. And our final panelist is Barbara Tinney, a native of the city of New Haven. She's the current executive director of the New Haven Family Alliance, a role she's had for, did you say 25 years? Yes. This says 20, but I think it's longer. She's worked in human development field for over 35 years and held positions in both private and public sectors. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you. Hi. So
why are you here tonight?
Yes. So after I got over the kind of, is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. I got over the kind of the audacity of the title of this panel, paved with good intentions, the white saviorism in the not-for-profit industrial complex. It struck a nerve. I mean, having witnessed and having worked with people, families, children, adolescents who have been just disinvested in, disregarded in this city, I thought that this was a timely, if for lack of a better way of putting it, a timely conversation to begin. Hopefully this is not a one and done, but a time to begin to talk about these issues.
Thank you. All right. We are very lucky to have the five of you on this panel, and you also match and are like, it's very interesting. So I'm going to direct this question to you specifically, Jordan. You recently wrote a book on the history and consequences of this savior mentality and social movements. And we'd like you to kind of describe from your research a couple things. One, the prototypical savior, and where that mindset and set of behaviors arose from, but also because tonight is specifically focused on white saviorism. Could you further define the behaviors, characteristics, and mentality of white saviorism, and include in that, in a short period of time, your own experience in relation to white saviorism?
Yes. So before I say anything, I just want to acknowledge that all of us here are on land stolen from Native American people through a process of genocide and colonization. And we're in a country and a land and a university built on the labor stolen from enslaved African people. And I want to say that I'm very grateful to be in this space with people that are resisting, very grateful to share the stage with this panel, to learn from the people in this panel, very grateful to the organizers that put this together. I was raised in a family and community and country that considered themselves opposed to racism and sexism, but at the same time were very much built and on a foundation of white supremacy and patriarchy. And I've been raised in this culture all my life that supports white supremacy, that supports patriarchy. You know, when I think about the culture around us, think about Batman, who is the perfect capitalist savior hero, this millionaire white man who spends all his money on his Batmobile and his Bat Cave, never thinking about giving away that money to others. That maybe he could solve some of these problems in Gotham if he spread around that wealth. We could have a whole nother panel, a whole nother discussion on the political ramifications of the Black Panther movie, but I won't even get into that. I know, it's awesome. But I will say that in the 90s, when Mario Van Peebles and his father Melvin Van Peebles tried to make a film about the Black Panther Party, Mario Van Peebles reported that when they went to producers, one producer said, "Could you make the main character, the main Black Panther, a white man?" Another producer said, "How about if you center the story on this like Berkeley white guy who meets 5 young black guys and teaches them to read and stand up for themselves, and then they become the Black Panther Party?" So this is the culture we're around in. This is the school system that most of us went through. I was really shaped in, or I guess my view evolved in this, especially from living in New Orleans. I'm from Miami originally, then lived in Massachusetts, New York. Moved to New Orleans about 15 years ago. I was a union organizer. And then when Hurricane Katrina happened, I evacuated a few days after the storm, got a ride in a helicopter that took me to a boat, that took me to this evacuee camp just outside of town. And there I saw how African Americans from New Orleans were being treated, forced to stand in the mud with National Guard soldiers standing guard over them, pointing guns at children, families getting separated as they were put on buses, not told where those buses were taking them. Eventually they were sent all around to all 48 continental states. Some people were put on planes, not told where the plane was going. And then got outside the media and saw our governor said, the governor of Louisiana said, "I'm sending in National Guard soldiers. They're locked and loaded. They've been trained to shoot to kill, and I expect they will." The black people from New Orleans were being called looters and thugs and criminals. At that point, I wrote an article, I wrote an email really to some friends, just saying the city I'd come to know in the couple of years of living there and what I'd seen in those last few days. And that email got forwarded all around and published in a few different places and ultimately translated into 8 different languages. And I started getting feedback from organizers I respected that this was something I could do to try to help tell these stories from New Orleans that weren't being told. So as a white cisgender male, I've been trying to find what is my role in movement, what made sense, and these mentors of mine were saying that this at this moment makes sense. So I came into journalism as someone that never planned to be a journalist, but it seemed like something useful in that moment. Tried to learn how to do journalism in a way that's accountable to the truth and also accountable to these movements for justice, to the people I'd learned from. And tried to find a way to do it in a way that was challenging white supremacy, challenging patriarchy in myself and others, thinking about different ways to do this. And that period of New Orleans taught me, after Katrina, also continued to teach me so much about the way this nonprofit industrial complex works, the way that these systems work. You had thousands, tens of thousands of idealistic activists coming to the city to save New Orleans with the best of intentions. But this complete lack of history of what they were coming into, this city, African-American city that had hundreds of years of history of fighting white supremacy, and these 20-year-old white kids would come into town being like, we're going to teach New Orleans about organizing. We're going to bring organizing to New Orleans. We're going to teach them what it means, right? And in fact, many of those activists fell in love with the city and moved into affordable housing and ended up making it even harder for African-Americans to come back to the city as they moved in. Soon there was a whole group of people that self-identified as YURPs, young urban rebuilding professionals, that came to work in this rebuilding process. And not only were they not interested in asking community members for feedback or advice or guidance, but in fact they were really proud about the fact that they were coming into what they called a blank slate, where they didn't have to ask people for their advice because they were displaced. So they could remake the school system, remake the housing system, remake the healthcare system without having to ask the people most affected. They were excited by this. As Kalamu Yasalam, a community organizer and teacher in New Orleans, said, it wasn't a blank slate, it was a graveyard, and they were rebuilding on people's bones. And that was what I saw in this city in that period. So for me, in answer to that question, I see the savior mentality as meaning a couple different things. One is what's known as this great man theory of history, right? This idea that the civil rights movement is Martin Luther King or maybe JFK or maybe LBJ, that ignores the millions of people that fought and died for freedom and ignores the way in which movements really work by mass participation and mass movement, and lessons of folks like Ella Baker, who led by empowering the voices of others. It's also this idea that communities being helped don't need or deserve to be consulted, that organizations or individuals can act as a savior in these communities, and that, like Batman, they will be thanked, they will be praised for their work, right? And I think that leads into this third aspect of the savior mentality, which is this lack of imagination that causes saviors to look for temporary solutions instead of systemic solutions, to not look at these underlying systems that cause the problems, to not look at white supremacy, at patriarchy, at capitalism, at the prison industrial complex, at systems. Instead, look at individual problems and think of individual solutions instead of how do we change this system so that we make the lives of all people better. So I've seen this come up in my work a lot in both colleagues and these movements I've covered. And the purpose of this book was to try to bring out not just these problems, but solutions that I've seen, ways that people have challenged it. And the purpose of events like this is to really hear from people locally that have challenged it. And so I will stop talking now.
Well, I will ask you if you can talk specifically about white saviorism.
I mean, I think it's intrinsically tied into that, right? Mm-hmm. That as a white person, I feel like I've been specifically taught that my views are better or more informed or more valuable, right? And that these positions of privilege that I have, that I was able to publish a book, that I get these positions, are just because of my value in person and not because of whatever systems of white supremacy allowed me to get to that position, ignores the long family history that allowed me to have this position. That I think that white supremacy is intrinsically tied up in all of this, and the savior mentality is intrinsically tied into that. And the colonization of this country was about this savior mentality, and about, the colonizers also said that they came here with the best of intentions, right? And that they were doing what was best, not just for themselves, but for the native communities who they were so-called civilizing.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask each panelist to answer the next question, which is, how do you define saviorism? And what have been your experiences specifically around white saviorism? And how do you see white saviorism playing out in your respective fields or organizations? And actually, do you want to go first?
I want to go
Go for it.
So my definition of white saviorism comes out of some work being done by the Community Healing Network, and essentially what the Community Healing Network speaks to the twin lies of white superiority and black inferiority that that twin lie is the foundation of racism in this country, and permeates much of what it happens in the nonprofit sector, and I'll kind of keep my comments to that area. As the best intended, and I think it's also important to say, as the best intended folk engage in this notion of white saviorism. The other way that I think about it is that white saviorism is, and I'm going to elevate it from the cousin of white supremacy to the sibling of white supremacy. It goes out of this notion that that I, as a white person or a white person, actually knows best what needs to be done on behalf of people of color, black people in particular, when it comes to addressing the consequences, the conditions that evolve out of oppression. And as someone who's been in the not-for-profit field for a very long time, and I truly believe that there is a purpose for us. It's kind of paradoxical because on one hand, as a nonprofit, we are one of the mechanisms that maintain the status quo. We are we're a safety valve that maintains the status quo. And on the other hand, if we weren't, some of us, not all of us, but if we weren't in business, more people would be dying. Because I don't think the average person has a true appreciation for the conditions that oppression, the conditions that people are living in, that are the results of this oppressive and unjust society. So, and the not-for-profit sector is replete with white saviors. And hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Kerry, can you speak to this? How are you defining saviorism, and what have been your experiences in relation to white saviorism? How's it shown up in your field or fields?
I think saviorism, kind of just like Jordan just explained, is intrinsic with white supremacy. So I think it operates in all our systems, that we coexist with. So I think saviorism, you can there's individuals that have a savior mindset, and there are institutions that run and operate through savior models. And I think that, so like in our schools, there's this kind of white savior-like approach I often think that school systems take in communities of color to fixing communities of color, fixing black children and brown children, and then when that fix doesn't work, disciplining them through a white supremacist tactic, right? So disciplining their bodies. If you don't follow this awesome program that I set forth, in the school, then you're gonna get sent to the detention room. If you sag your pants in a certain way, I don't like that. I don't think that looks respectable. You're gonna get. There's certain schools I've heard with codes that almost sound like felonies, that claim to be empowering children of color and communities of color. I think it shows up in the way that white folks like to see communities of color policed. So New Haven, from what I understand, gets a ton of money around community policing. And to me, and what I've seen in my community, is that's a very toxic system. But because people like the idea, the relationship of white men walking through neighborhoods and waving hi and knowing, you know, the neighbor speaking to the child, the ice cream stories I've seen online. I think, you know, that's the narrative of it, but it really is toxic. It really creates violence, huge amounts of violence, and it operates in so many different ways. So community policing in my neighborhood looks like the cop walking up the block and being like, hey, you have a warrant. You know, did you, jump in this van? But because whole groups of white folks around New Haven and Connecticut really like this model, it's funded, and from what I understand, New Haven gets a lot of money for community policing, and to me, it's not a system that speaks to what it says it does. And I've seen white saviorism in a lot of ways. I see it sometimes especially in youth programs, in ways where folks who develop, primarily white folks, primarily white boards, primarily white directors who develop programs that essentially want youth of color to perform, and there's nothing wrong with performance, but to perform, but not really to get down and radically organized. And wanting to kind of perform their pain, but not really get down to dismantling the systems that oppress them, that are around them, that they have to exist within. There's a lot more I have to say, but I'm gonna. The other panelists.
Thank you. And just so y'all know, we are going to open up to questions from the audience. I didn't say that, but we'll do a little talking together and then open it up to all of you. So Erin, how are you defining saviorism, and what have been your experiences in relation to white saviorism specifically? How does it show up in the health field?
Yeah, the health field. So for me, when I think about saviorism, it's not allowing, not providing space, not creating a situation where patients, folks, people we're educating, the community has a space to own their problems, and also has a space to own their solutions. I think of, rooms full of, highly educated folks looking at data, public health information and saying, hey, there's a need here, we should go fix that need, without consulting that community, that group, and saying, hey, what are their needs to you? What are the things that are coming up for you first? And that community may say, we have these other needs, and so how do those two groups work together? And how are the valid, expert, lived stories and situations in those communities elevated to even be above the knowledge that the doctors, that the public health professionals have, that lived experience is just as valid, if not more valid, than the folks with the data. So think about that. And then as a white woman, I grapple with white saviors and white supremacy daily, and that's as a mom of two small white kids, like, what am I doing to, find that balance within myself to center the communities that have the biggest need, regardless of what I think that they should do. In terms of how it shows up in my work, as a sex educator, it's getting phone calls from these desperate, high school teachers saying, prom's coming, come talk to them about condoms. And it's like, they're seniors, where was the conversation? Is that even what they want to talk about? And then going into those classrooms, because it's like, okay, this is my opportunity, they're asking me, and then getting there, and the young people want to talk about consent and relationships, and hey, I'm being hurt, and how do I handle these things? They want the subjective, conversations when you actually get in there and ask, what those young folks want. And looking in my own life, early in my career, as right out of college, I went to Oberlin College. Our phrase was, think one person can change the world. So, having that saviorist mentality sort of ingrained from the beginning, and being this young person and sitting with this young woman and saying, She's struggling to figure out what birth control method she wants. We're going back and forth, and finally I'm like, hey, try this, it works for me. She did. She got pregnant. I didn't do the self-reflection. I didn't do the what are the barriers to this method in her life. So yeah, I've completely effed up. And how do I, move past that, work through that, take the feedback, get held accountable, whether it's individual relationships with one patient, whether it's sitting in a community, whether it's putting together a youth program. How do we center the communities? And so white saviorism to me is not taking the pause and slowing down and asking those kinds of questions.
Thank you. And Kika.
So I work in an organization whose mission is to empower people to change communities and influence policies for the better. What that means for us is that we have spent decades now trying to build out social justice movement. I want to talk a little bit about the work that I do on the immigrant rights front, because I think it speaks to some of the challenges that we face when we talk about white saviorism in a very real way. So CCC started working on the immigrant rights front in 2001. And the reason we did that is because nobody was talking about the undocumented. Right? When people were talking about immigration, it was mostly legal immigration, even though there were millions of people already here without status living in the shadows. And in addition to that, not only was no one talking about the undocumented, but the people who were articulating the vision for immigration, and those who were on TV were white men in red ties, who really had no lived experiences of the kinds of challenges that immigrants were going through, particularly the most vulnerable. So we started working to build movement, and we did that by supporting organizations led by those most affected. We do movement building trainings to this day all over the country where we work with those most affected, and we do leadership trainings, and we provide opportunities for people to be in the front lines of the movement. And we are also what they call as the connection between the Beltway and communities. We are very aggressive about making sure that those most affected are in the face of members of Congress, are in the White House, demanding that the conditions in their lives change. I would like to say that 17 years later, white saviorism doesn't show up in the immigration work, but unfortunately it does. It does because our TV stations, and I'm not going to go into an analysis of who owns the TV stations, but even to this day, when we're talking about immigration issues that affect the undocumented, it is still white men in suits who talk about and speak on behalf of people whose experience they really do not understand, right? That's a real problem. It's a real problem when those who are in the White House and those who are meeting with legislators are heard and given more time because they are privileged people in positions of power. That still happens. And I'm gonna end because I don't want to take up too much time. So we really still have this problem of structural racism and white saviorism. A lot of people, and let me just say, the interesting thing is, as we have worked to create movements, there is still this hierarchy of those people who are policy advocates, those people who are lobbyists, are privileged people, many of whom I have met through this institution, right? They are the ones that wield the most power. Those of us on the streets, those of us putting our bodies on the line, those of us taking the biggest risk are people who look like me. We are the ones who end up in jail. We are the ones who get escorted out of legislators' offices. We are the ones that nobody has the time for. And so it requires to be much more ferocious, particularly now under this administration. But let me give you an example of some of the recent challenges we've had with white saviorism. So I've been very involved in the fight for DREAM Act legislation, particularly after DACA was eliminated in September. And we were having a conversation. There was a campaign called the Defend Our Dream campaigns, and all of the principals of the Defend Our Dream campaign were having a meeting. And it was during a time when we really did think that we had hope of advancing DREAM Act legislation. And so we were having a very nuts and bolts conversation about who were our targets. And we wanted to make sure that we were hitting our targets. In my organization and a labor organization, SEIU, and a youth advocacy organization, United We Dream, we were the 3 organizations that were leading the field efforts. We were the boots on the ground. So we're having this conversation about, okay, who's got who's going to visit who, how are we going to put street pressure on these legislators? And a white man who's very smart, he works for a very elite policy organization. And I think he might have gone to Yale Law School, in fact. He said, I have a comment and a question to make. And we said, okay. And then he started to talk about how some of our targets, particularly the more conservative targets, did not take well to immigrants visiting their offices. And so wouldn't it be better if for those conservative targets, we not have affected immigrants and people of color visit them? Shouldn't we be instead looking for influential white people to be the ones to carry our message? And I remember sitting there thinking, did I really hear this right? And so I said, you mean, should we stop advocating with these legislators because you think we're offending them? And he said, yes. That is one of the more insidious ways that white saviorism shows up. And I will say, I'll start by saying, I remember, those of you who know me know how I can run my mouth. I ran my mouth, and still to this day, I don't remember what I said, except that when I was done, there was just this long silence in the room.
Thank you. So, Kerry, I'm going to ask you this question, and maybe we'll ask one other person too. But how do you think about the link between white saviorism and the nonprofit industrial complex? So, coming back to that, all of that definition of what the nonprofit industrial complex. You don't have to come back to all of it, but the pieces of it.
Yeah, I think the link is direct. It goes hand in hand. I don't know like what that means, but like one feeds the other. I think. I mean, I've worked at organizations that have been completely led and run by white people with great intentions, people with good intentions, but the leadership of the organization, is completely white-led, and the people that, and it's not just one organization, but it's so many organizations. I think the people that often the people that work at the bottom, that run the programs, or that do the organizing, or do the really hard, laborful work, are people of color, and are often vulnerable to, in these white-led organizations, when they start to disrupt the white saviorism within the organizations, the first to be vulnerable and the first on the chopping block of these nonprofits. Trying to think. I'm a little nervous, y'all, so bear with me.
You're great.
Yeah, you ever be so immersed in something that it's just like all over you, and sometimes you don't have the language to unpack it. And I think it's often that too. It's often, I think, white saviorism and folks with good intentions and organizations and nonprofit organizations constantly center themselves. As Jordan talked about centering white folks who center themselves in these spaces, and don't really know how to listen to the demographic that they often serve, which is mostly, predominantly, at least in New Haven, communities of color, whether it be youth, parents. Yeah, I think it looks like, not listening, not having your programs be informed by those people that you service. And again, when folks try to disrupt that, becoming very fragile. And when folks try to raise the issue of my good friend Camille Seabury, I don't know if she's in the room, but she made a post on Facebook the other day that said, that called out the anti-racist racist. But that when you call the anti-racist racist out, which oftentimes working class folks who are, whether they're being serviced or working in these organizations, have to do at some point, you know, you become vulnerable, blacklisted, again, let go. I have plenty of friends who have spoken up or spoken to things that they could have seen being done differently, and who have been fired, or disciplined. We were doing really important organizing around a case in New Haven of a man who was shot by police and accused of, assaulting a cop. And we were working around his trial and trying to get him free of those charges that he was innocent from. And the organization that me and some of my comrades worked for claimed to, you know, or said, I think that they, you know, to do really important work in communities of color in New Haven, and wanted to empower those communities. But when we had to, when we needed to physically be at the space to do the organizing, me and some of my comrades who worked at this organization, we were suspended for a day because we had to call out to do that work. So the very same bodies that you service that are the black and brown bodies that are vulnerable to police violence every day, right? And that have to defend themselves in these communities from that, right? It's not honor when you have to show up. The organization that claims to be doing the work in that community and holding that community up doesn't really get the importance of showing up. And we as workers of that organization were suspended for a day or something like that without pay. But those, you know, these are the kind of the microaggressions of white saviorism. You know, we get you know, these white organizations, and there are a lot in New Haven. I don't have the data that says how many are white, how many are led by white boards, and how many have white directors. But there are a lot of microaggressions that come out because I think organizations that are kind of ran by white groupthink don't really see the importance, or oblivious to or ignorant to having to do the work of unpacking racism, bias, microaggressions, and, you know, really fragile when it comes to stepping in that space.
Thank you. Barbara, do you want to respond to this question? The link between white saviorism and the nonprofit industrial complex?
So, thank you. The link is pretty direct. I think for any number of not-for-profits, their sources of funding are a result of, or a representation of this notion of white saviorism, whether it's foundation funding, particularly with private funding. So I think there needs to be a distinction between private funding that that comes through foundations, that are donations, that are, you know, sort of tax exempt, but tax exempt dollars that then fund efforts in not-for-profit organizations that represent the interests of the folks whose monies are being spent. So at the not-for-profit level, you know, I think it's just plain, you know, there's a hard line between white saviorism and philanthropic dollars and not-for-profit work. But I think that we need to make a distinction between that and funding from state organizations. That's really about containment. You know, and being able to distinguish between the two. As a not-for-profit organization and as a not-for-profit leader, it is my responsibility to understand my dual role as a resource to, and I think the risk being redundant, as a resource to people who are disinvested in, mostly people, people of color, black people in particular, and as that mechanism of control. But I thought that one other thing I wanted to make a point of view. So how does this, because I think white saviorism shows up today in some fairly insidious, or maybe not so insidious ways.
Yes, it is.
But there have been a couple of things that have really caught my attention over the last few years. And it has to do with so New Haven is a college town. We're a little burg with a whole bunch of schools around us. And most recently, this whole notion of, service learning? Mm-hmm. Where students, mostly white students, come into mostly communities of color to do something. And what became fairly clear to me fairly quickly is that the representatives of these institutions could articulate the benefit to the student and the student body, but not so much for the benefit to the communities that were serving as this learning laboratory. Where real people and real families lived. So that's one thing that I think is a contemporary manifestation of white saviorism with good. Let me take that back because I don't know how good the intentions were. The second, I think, and even more important, is the what's the word I'm searching for here? Is the pathologizing of people of color with using different language. And so, for instance, so our schools are now, we have schools in New Haven that are now trauma-informed schools. And this notion of urban trauma, that's myself, but this notion of trauma grew out of a Kaiser Permanente study of about 1,700 people. Less than 500 of them were people of color, were black people, and none of them were under the age of 19. However, that study, and then studies that have been conducted after, the ACEs study, adverse childhood events, that placed the responsibility for the condition that some of our children find themselves in squarely on parents or the communities that they live in. Take absolutely, unless I missed it, I don't know if anybody in here has read it, take absolutely no interest in the systemic oppression that undergirds these communities. So we get this trauma-informed, so this trauma, these kids are traumatized by their parents, and now we have trauma-informed schools in New Haven. We have trauma-informed schools in New Haven. So our children have gone from being disadvantaged to now traumatized by their families, as opposed to these oppressive systems that create the conditions that these people the families have to live in. Yeah. So that's
Thank you. Well, so I want to just ask a few more questions, and then I'll open us up to questions from the audience. One question is, because part of the intention tonight was to create space for people to look at ourselves and how we might be having this mentality, a savior mentality, and not a savior mentality for all of us, and specifically a white savior mentality for white people. I want to ask the question for, Aaron, you have the mic, so I'll start with you. Can you talk about a time where your best intentions didn't work? And you did a little bit in your introductions, but if you have, in your earlier statements, but, where you made a mistake despite what your intentions were. And I'm going to ask a few of you to do this.
Aside from, I kind of jumped the gun with my birth control story. What's coming up for me right now is thinking about my role as a leader, in the different organizations I've worked in, being a trainer, being an educator, and not wanting to create space for the folks that I'm training and working with, and not holding them accountable, and not, you know, seeing and hearing the saviorist mindset in them, and not speaking up, not, you know, aligning with, you know, what I say my values are, not being who I say I am, and watching that saviorist mindset be a barrier to the mission that we're trying to, you know, enact or be a part of in the communities. And then that mindset lends to sort of, you know, this dismissal of the patient's needs, the community's needs, the students' needs, and we end up looking down on them. You know, so I think of, you know, a patient that we've made a follow-up plan for, you know, because, you know, they've had an infection multiple times, and we're really worried about that, and we know that there's rates of this infection, you know, are really high in the community, and the patient doesn't follow up, and it's like, well, we told them about their infection, they know what they need to do, I did my part, I tried to help, it's not like, so then you look down upon this person without acknowledging that maybe they've got other, you know, they've, you know, homeless issues, or they don't have food, or they don't, like, what are the other things, what's the holistic view, you know, so it's getting trapped in that, like, well, I did my part, I checked off my box, and, you know, my role in that as a leader, as a trainer, as, you know, of guiding and mentoring new folks. I mean, I've been in the healthcare field for many years. You know, and so breaking that apart and pausing and saying, hey, we gotta look at this and address this. So how do I show up in every planning meeting? How do I show up and, you know, align my values with who I say I am? And hold other white folks accountable, hold other staff accountable. So yeah, I'm checking that in myself every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for talking about that level of what's happening in your mind. Kika, you have an example also?
I have many examples, but given the time limitations, I'm going to focus just on one. And this is really my own mistakes based on my privilege as a citizen. So I ran a nonprofit organization in Fairhaven called Junta for Progressive Action. And we did a lot of advocacy on behalf of undocumented immigrants. And I remember one winter afternoon, some folks showed up and they told us this story about living a few blocks from Junta and having problems with their landlord, such that the landlord had, even though they paid this landlord for utilities, the landlord had cut off their electricity, and so they had no electricity and they had no heat. And so I called the Livable City Initiative, a friend of mine, and he said, all right, let's take care of this, and then we'll, you know, in the short term, and then we can figure out the long-term problems. So we agreed that we would meet at their apartment. And when we walked into the apartment, I remember it was like this, and I walked through the kitchen, and then the first thing I saw was there was this bedroom, and the only thing in that bedroom was a mattress. And there were people huddled on the mattress. It turned out to be 10 people huddled on a mattress and an infant child. So we started sealing the windows, and the LCI guy tapped into the electricity. I won't tell you what he did, but he basically borrowed electricity from a next-door neighbor so that they would keep warm for the night. And then I said to them, come to Junta tomorrow, and we're going to really try to help you out. So they came in the next day, and we did intake. And in the course of the intake, it turned out that the landlord was a notorious landlord who is Latina, and she would only rent to undocumented immigrants. And she had a really good spin. Her spin was, you know, I'm from Cuba, and I know the struggles that immigrants have, and so I'm going to help you out. But it really was a ploy to rip off immigrants. And in the course of intake, we found out that she was renting. There were 10 people living in that apartment and an infant, and she was charging, it was a one-bedroom apartment, she was charging each tenant $400 a month to live in that apartment. And I was so filled with rage and indignation, and I thought I knew what the hell I was doing, so I said, okay, we're gonna throw the book at this landlord. And so I wrote her a letter threatening legal action. we got in touch with some of the lawyers from Yale Law School that were working there, and I said, okay, we're gonna walk through the options, right? These are some of the things that you can do on your behalf. What do you want us to do? And they were very supportive. We can take legal action, and we can support you, and we can make sure that you get whatever services you need in the meantime. And they were really happy, very supportive, and then they left Junta. And then we found out from one of my colleagues who worked at Junta, she said to me a couple of days later that they came back, and that the landlord's husband had started harassing them. And every time they came out of their apartment to go to work, the landlord's husband would be there threatening to call La Migra, ICE, on them. And so they were tremendously afraid, they were terrified, and they wouldn't let up. And she threatened to evict them, she threatened to call ICE, so on and so forth. The long and the short of it, because I don't want to take up too much time, is that they ended up not seeking legal recourse. They ended up not following up on all of the things that we offered that they wanted. They ended up moving out of their apartment, right? And that was a real lesson for me, because even though I was very intentional about making sure that I worked with them to identify the things that they wanted, right? What was lost in it was that I had a sense of privilege as a U.S. citizen that they did not have. And so the solutions that we came up with were really not specific to their reality. And so that is one of many lessons and one of the many ways I get my ass kicked every day.
Thank you for that very clear example. Yeah. Jordan, I'm going to ask you a question, then we're going to, maybe we'll have time for someone else, but then we're going to open it up. And so if we agree that saviorism presents a problematic motivation for participating in social movements, how can we approach the work in a different way? What does collective action or efforts to dismantle systems of oppression look like in practice? And I'm asking you this question because I know you did a lot of research on this, and I know everybody on this panel could answer this question too.
Hi again, everybody. Yeah, I think I spent a lot of time with a lot of brilliant organizers that thought through this a lot. They don't all necessarily agree with each other, but some of the common themes that I heard come out is, first of all, this question of accountability, right? If you're going into a community, who are you accountable to in that community? And oftentimes, we hold up one person and we're like, this person wants us there, so they're going to represent the whole community and we'll just be accountable to them, right? So how are you accountable to the community? What does community mean? How are you defining community? And also, how are you really taking feedback from people, right? If people really want you to change course, are you really going to change course? Will you change course completely, even if you have this big grant that you just got saying that you're going to do this one thing? If community tells you that they don't want that, are you going to really change your course, right? So if your organization is going to be working in the community, how are you really taking feedback from the community? And also, how are you taking leadership from the community in terms of within your organization, right? Those people from the community should be leading your organization. They should be in your organization. If you're serving a community, but people from that community aren't in your organization, why is that, right? So accountability when you're working in a community. And then also accountability within the organization. If there are toxic relationships or toxic behaviors within your organization, how is that addressed within the organization? What does the accountability look like within your organization as well? Is there the founder's mentality, right, where you've got one director of the organization that's been there for 20 years and no one can really question them? And also, so how much are people free to push for changes within that organization? As organizers, I also think the lesson of the Zapatistas is important. There's one phrase that they use that I really love that says, walking, we ask questions. And for me, that means that as someone with privilege, it's often, I'm often so afraid to take action that I do nothing. And I think it's important to not fall into that trap of doing nothing. So I think the walking part is important, but then to really be interrogating as you walk. So being, again, really ready to completely change course based on feedback. So taking action and then being able to take feedback and to completely change that action. I think often there's this goal that we will be the most perfect organizer, that will make mistakes, and that I think is an impossible goal. I think the better goal is, what do you do on the day after the mistake? right? So what I've done so much wrong. We just had a question about that interpersonally, organizationally, and for me, the challenge to myself is not to decide that I'll never do anything wrong, although God, I really hope so, but to really to do right on the next day, to be able to hear that feedback, to listen to that feedback, to take it in, even when it's really hard. I think it's great that Kerry raised that subject of white fragility, right? I am so fragile. And so being able to take that feedback and to really work with it and to really make amends. The question I ask myself again is what do I do on the day after I've made those mistakes? And do I have another few seconds? Or?
Well, I want to open it up.
All right, let's open it up.
Yeah, let's take that Zapatista's walking, we ask questions, and I just invite all of you to think. You're not going to have a chance to ask it, but to think, what is your question? What is the thing that's really up for you around this? What is the conversation that you either want to have here, or you want to have later tonight, or you want to have with your comrades tomorrow? We're gonna have someone come around and run the mic and hold the mic for people, and we'll take 3 questions at once, just so we can get more questions out from the audience. I'd ask that when you ask a question, if you could direct it to a person you want to hear from, that would be great, and that you're as concise as possible, given that we want to get as many in as we can. So raise your hand if you have a question. In the back. Okay. I saw his hand first, but please go ahead first, and then we'll go back there.
Hi, I want to ask about white saviorism in regard to power, and who are the people who are able to have mortgages? Who are the people who are able to have debt in regard to having cars? Who are the people who are just struggling from paycheck to paycheck? So what is the solution in regard to power and fixing oppression and making sure that people of color who are more than qualified to head these organizations in New Haven and know about the people that they're serving, how do they get into power? Because many of us who are hired as consultants are blacklisted when we're hired to go out into the community and tell the truth, and we come back and tell the truth, and we're not heard.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you.
How y'all doing, everybody? This will kind of piggyback off what she was asking. I just wanted to know you guys' thoughts on reparations. I believe that the solution would be financial freedom. If we got some kind of jump start from the government, we would be able to empower our communities. Therefore, we would be better schooling, maybe a grocery store, maybe the local baker or the local caterer in the community. Because, like they said, in the Jewish community, money goes over in the Jewish community over 80 times before it leaves the community, and black people 1 time, before it's out of the community. So I think that if we did something to empower the black community, then that will allow us to have more power. Maybe we can fund that politician that we need to, or maybe we can fund the teacher or principal to give us education to teach us about our own. You know what I'm saying? So what are your thoughts about reparations? Do you think that we need some kind of jump start?
Thank you. Thank you. Is there one more before we have folks talk about all 3?
Hey.
Addis.
Hi. So a question for Kika and Ms. Tinney. With respect to creating organizations, or for those of us who do the organizing work on the street, most of the time they have to have 501c3s in order to apply for grants and what have you. So what advice do you have for those of us who do have to work within that structure to not even though when we're trying to recreate structures, we keep duplicating the same white supremacy structure. So what advice do you have for those of us who do have to operate within the 501c structure to not replicate the same oppression that we're trying to fight?
Thank you. Thank you. What great question. So I know the first 2 questions were directed to the panel in general. Is there somebody who wants to take up the questions about power, giving up jobs, white people giving up power, and the way that white people stay and work for the financial incentive, and what would it be to give that up? Jordan.
I'll just say really quick that I think really carefully about jobs that I go for. I think I would, I would not take a job running an organization, especially running an organization that worked in communities of color. I think that, I talked in the book to the leaders of Southerners on New Ground, which is a multiracial LGBT organization in the Deep South. There was a white woman and a woman of color that led that organization together. And yeah, I know, and Caitlin Breedlove, who ran that organization, would definitely not have run that organization herself, and in fact went through a process of phasing herself out of the organization. And I'll just say really quickly, yes to reparations, but also end capitalism.
End capitalism, you said, right? Reparations and end capitalism. Yes. Other folks want to respond? Yeah, absolutely. We'll do Kerry and then you, Barbara. Kerry has a mic.
I think, just in terms of the sheer number of nonprofits in New Haven that have missions situated within justice work, within anti-oppression work, and anti-racism work, I think a big problem within the nonprofit industrial complex these systems are really private. It's really hard for the communities that they're situated in, for the people in the communities that these organizations are situated in, to say, hey, you're in my community, this should be an institution that I have power over. So I think I think the work of figuring out how to shift that power is like us being unapologetic about that, but that takes a lot of work on people of color, on working class folks, on low income folks. Sometimes we're not even in the know that these organizations are getting these grants in the names of our communities, getting this amount of money and these amount of resources. So I think it's like kind of busting through the door and, for lack of a better way to saying it, taking it over, invading those spaces, right? If we were gonna kind of just, I'm in history class all day, I've been in a section on imperialism and colonialism in the 1800s and how, Europe just invaded. I think we just need to invade these spaces in our communities and take them back. And I don't know what that looks like. But I think that nonprofits should be permeable enough if they're really, doing the work that they say they're doing, to be accountable to people wanting to reoccupy those spaces and pushing people that don't belong there out.
Yes, thank you. Barbara, you wanted to add something?
Well, actually, I wanted to respond to Addis.
Yeah, Addis is over there.
Okay. In regard to doing justice work and under the umbrella of being a 501c3, and there are a handful, literally a handful of funders who actually respect and support social justice work. It's a matter of trying to find who they are. And partnering with organizations that have a 501c3 designation, who are willing to serve as fiduciaries for the funds that you might be able to get before or whether or not you have the 501c3. I think that there is room for partnering with right-minded not-for-profit organizations, and I want to, kind of stick up for my my colleagues who are right-minded about what we're doing. We know our place, what role we play, and are open to, developing, partnerships that don't sustain the injustices that the people that we serve live with every day.
I know, Kika, you want to say something?
So where's my sister Addis? So Addis, my words to you would be as follows. You can liberate your people and fight for justice and play the game and not sell out. And it is way more challenging to do that, but you can do it. And I'm going to give you an example of somebody that I'm sure you know, who has managed to do that beautifully, and that's John Lugo, Unidad Latina en Acción, right? How many of you know John? John is my brother in the struggle. I love him like a brother. He is one of the most fearless, unapologetic, radical people and brilliant people that I have ever worked with. And I love working with John because he pushes me to be my best and my most fearless, and he always has my back, but he's completely uncompromising. And he started a nonprofit, he started an organization. He would kill me if I called it a nonprofit organization. He started an organization called Unidad Latina en Acción. The reason he started it was because undocumented immigrants in New Haven did not have a voice and did not have a vehicle to fight for justice for themselves and their families. ULA, which is the acronym, is not a 501c3 organization, and the reason it's not a 501c3 organization is because he refuses to play the game. So what he has done is he has found allies in the struggle who are willing to serve as his fiscal sponsor, right? So he understands that he has to play the game to get resources in order to do the brilliant, radical work that he does, but he also knows that he doesn't want to be a part of that. And others have stepped up, and I think we haven't talked about this, but there is a role for allies, and there's a role for white allies in the struggle, right? And this is one of the ways where white allies and people who are connected with our nonprofit organizations step up in ways that are meaningful.
Thank you. I don't want to miss the question about reparations and financial freedom for Black people. I know Jordan answered it. I wanted to see if anybody else wants to speak to it.
I think that all for reparations, and I think that nonprofit organizations, philanthropic organizations need to make clear statements around their support for reparations if they do. I think, and I think, again, another way that the nonprofit industrial complex silos us into issues, and it keeps us from having these larger systemic conversations around dismantling white supremacy and getting liberation for oppressed peoples. So I think I'm excited to see. I don't know if this will ever happen, but to see institutions to step up and make statements in favor of things like reparations, really important things like reparations. Yeah. Can I say something really fast? Just on a smaller scale, we were organizing around People Against Police Brutality, Black Lives Matter New Haven, CT Core, Organized Now, and a bunch of other allies and comrades were currently organizing around Justice for Jason Negron, who was murdered in Bridgeport on May 9th of 2017. We called on organizations and called on nonprofits and called on philanthropic organizations to make statements, to write letters to make statements of solidarity and support of the officer who murdered Jason, to write letters to the Chief State's Attorney's Office, I would say, up in Rocky Hill, to call for the transparent investigation into the officer's deadly force and a call for the officer to be charged. And we got very limited response from organizations that claim to be doing work around racism, work with youth, Black and brown youth. We got very few responses. Very few people wanted to put their organizational name and their institution on the line to call for that. So we're struggling with just those basic asks. I don't know how we'll get to a larger ask for reparations, but I want to see it.
Yeah. Thank you. Somebody else want to make a comment? I have one more question for the panel before we close. And
That's okay.
so you kind of started this, Kika and Kerry, but we want to ask the question about being in a critical space of thinking about the savior mentality, thinking about specifically about white saviorism. How do white people, how do people who want to be breaking out of the savior mentality, how can we be allies and co-conspirators to show up for the work in general, work of social justice, but also specifically the work that you all are doing on this panel? We want to create some space for that, for you to specifically say that to the group of people in the room. and maybe Facebook Live if it's happening.
Look, you know, we are never going to be the kind of country that we aspire to be if we don't do this collectively, right? And so what I would say to my white allies is to show up, right? Be intentional in the way that you show up. Be courageous in moments when you realize that your courageous act will advance an agenda. And I will say this, be really humble. Right? Take time to really learn about the issue and the community and the people that you're working with and for and of service to. And like Jordan said, you know, discard your white fragility, right? If you are truly a revolutionary in the struggle, that means that you've got to be willing to get your ass kicked and to hear things that you may not want to hear. Let me give you one quick example of an organization that surprised me. Because the way that they have shown up on immigration has been, to me, astounding. And I was an incredible cynic at first. Indivisible, Shoreline Indivisible, right? They threw down right after the elections. They said, we want to figure out how we could be part of the resistance and show up for and support immigrants. And I thought, oh boy, I've heard this before. Here we go, yet another white savior. But the way that they have gone about doing their work is very much focused on what can we best do to be of service to immigrants. Last week I worked with them on the case of a Nigerian man who's been given a deportation order of April 8th. He has 6 kids, 2 of them have autism. The government doesn't give a shit. He's been living here for 29 years. He has not been in Nigeria to Nigeria for 29 years. So what has Indivisible done? They're working, they put together teams to help the lawyers reach out to autism experts. They have worked to do intake for the families, right? They've worked with the family to figure out what kind of support the family needs. And they're also working with us to put together a strategy, right? So their intentionality was about how can we best work with immigrant advocates to try to stop this man's deportation.
I think what's coming up for me is giving props to Barbara Tinney and New Haven Family Alliance. They also run the Male Involvement Network program, and that was vital in my journey around centering the community in the groups that Planned Parenthood works with, and you know, going in as a younger version of myself and wanting to provide sex education to men just released out of prison, and quickly realizing that they have centered the men. The men came together and said, this is the service that they want. This is, you know, the things that we need. And then Barbara and her team reaching out to and asking for resources from Planned Parenthood. It wasn't about Planned Parenthood saying, I want to go in and do this. We were asked. And so, you know, as a white-led organization, as a white person, it's being ready when asked, being available, being, you know, and doing the work and saying, how do I partner with and center the organization, you know, the community that has the need. And so thank you for being part of my journey on an individual level, and then looking and seeking out groups that are centering and doing that work is super important.
Just a little background on the Male Involvement Network. It's a program. I don't know what we want to call it. An effort to engage men who are fathers, primarily African American and Latina dads, who have a non-custodial, who want to do work themselves so that they are better able to engage with their children. You know, we've been at this for about 14 to 15 years. This is a population, well, you know, the only deal, when we started the two systems that were in place for fathers, men, or the armed services, and Department of Corrections. And I want to give a shout out to someone, I don't think she's here, a warrior for justice, Barbara Fair, who has been trying to pull us into organizing around the prison industrial complex, and the way that they eat up African American men.
Thank you.
So I think it's important to lift up those, the folk up. And
do you want to speak to ways that the allies or co-conspirators could show up?
So what comes to mind for me are the allies that I have had in my work over these many, many years. And these are the white allies. And these are people who have done the work, who have actually done the work on themselves.
The internal work.
Internal work. And are open to the critical feedback that they need to have in order to move forward. And who have committed themselves to doing that work with their white counterparts. To doing that hard work with people who look like them in an effort to move a justice agenda forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. Jordan, do you want to answer this question about something specifically, or should we jump to Kerry? You're welcome to.
I'll just say really quickly, first of all, I just want to add on the question of Black economic empowerment to look at the work of Cooperation Jackson, also in their work, electing a revolutionary Black nationalist mayor in Jackson, Mississippi, and building Black economic alternatives. And then specifically to your question really quickly, Paulina Helm Hernandez, queer Latina organizer and artist, co-director of Southerners on New Ground, I mentioned earlier, multiracial LGBT organization in the Deep South, said, I think white people in movement building need to make a call about whether they will be individual activists or if they're really ready to commit to collective organizing. The latter means that you don't have to always be the final vote on the strategy, pace, timing, tone, and approach. It means you have to learn how to share political imagination, power, and work without having to always be in charge. At the same time, she adds, I don't want white people to get declawed and told they should just sit quietly in meetings and then follow people of color around and ask them what to do. I want them to have their claws. They need them. We're in a region, a moment, a country where those claws are needed for the enemies who are killing us.
Thank you. Oh, I'm so glad you went.
The crazy thing is I was going to ask Jordan if I could read that section because that really stood out to me. Because oftentimes when white folks step into the space of unpacking their racism and their whiteness, they become so fragile that they do follow you around and they do become declawed. And it becomes a nuisance because it's, again, you're centering yourself, right? It's, what am I doing wrong? Am I doing this right? Can I do this for you? How can I do this? And I think just what you and Sister Paula spoke to in regards to keeping your claws is so important. The end of that quote just talks about how we're being killed, how people of color are being killed, and how we need those claws to help to dismantle our oppressors. So I think it's, for me, I think how accomplices can show up. I think one is just understanding what an accomplice is, and finding your claws if you don't have them, and knowing that you have to use them, like it's not an option. Like if you're about the work, you have to use them. You should be using them every day. It shouldn't be like, it shouldn't be like getting off, going to your 9 to 5 and you're doing your justice work and you're done. It should never be done. And constantly figuring and constantly unpacking, and I don't have the right answer, I don't claim to know the answer, but just constantly, unpacking that, and clawing at oppressive systems and whatever that means to you and whatever space you're in. But not putting your body on the line and not watching as people of color do that and standing back. But putting your body on the line, your pockets on the line, your position on the line, because that's what people of color have to do every single day. So stepping out of your comfort zone.
And let me just add to that, and I was trying to say it earlier, but I didn't quite get it right, and that's that when my white allies sometimes use their claws, they might get some kind of reprimand. Maybe, they'll get pushed back. when I hiss, I could get shot. Right? So that is one of the really, when you think about your power and the way you wield your power, think about the ways that you can step up to fight for liberation and also have the back of those of us who have whose lives are at stake in the work that we do.
Whew. Can we leave it up for this panel? How many of you all would like to stay in this conversation?
Okay, amazing. Another round of applause, please. All right, so at the Health Justice Collaborative, we like to end all of our events with a call to action. So here are some things that we brainstormed that you can do. One is join our mailing list. Boring, but we're on Facebook. You can participate in events on campus that we're doing. Another is to do what the panelists just asked you to do. So listening to what they say and acting on it. A third is Jordan does have books. Both Robert and I have read the book, and it was incredibly educational. So buy the book, start a book club. White people make a book club, teach each other, etc.
Kayla, the books are sliding scale.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
so there are two books, Floodlines and No More Heroes, and the book is on a sliding scale. So you can talk to Jordan about whatever you're able to pay. And can someone next to the computer just go to the next slide?